The command cut through the lamplight like a blade forged in ice. "Take off your dress. Lie down." Silas Thornwood's voice carried no warmth, no tenderness, nothing that resembled the gentle words a bride might expect on her wedding night. His words fell heavy in the small cabin, landing somewhere between an order and a verdict. Grace Ellen Whitmore stood frozen by the brass bed, her fingers trembling against the worn fabric of her traveling dress. She had heard commands like this before, 3 times to be exact, from 3 different men in 3 different rooms across 3 different states. None of those nights had ended the way the world promised wedding nights should end. But she obeyed. She always obeyed. That was what women like her did. Women too tall, too broad, too plain to have choices. Women who had learned that obedience was the only currency they possessed. The cabin was small, barely larger than the horse stall where she had spent her last night in San Francisco. A single room divided by a curtain, a wood stove in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the Montana winter, and a bed that looked like it had seen decades of loneliness pressed into its mattress. Silas Thornwood stood 3 feet away from her, his massive frame blocking the door as if she might try to escape. At 6'4", he was one of the few men she had ever met who made her feel small. His beard was black and thick, covering half his face like a mask. His eyes were darker, still reflecting the lamplight with the flat shine of river stones. He had barely spoken 20 words to her since picking her up at Bozeman Station that afternoon. No pleasantries, no questions about her journey, just a grunt of acknowledgement when she confirmed she was Grace Whitmore, and then 6 hours of silence as they rode through the snow-covered mountains to this isolated cabin 40 miles from the nearest town. Now he stood watching her, his expression unreadable beneath that wilderness of beard. Grace's fingers found the buttons running down her back, but they were shaking too badly to grip properly. 3 failed attempts left her standing there, humiliation burning through her chest like whiskey on an empty stomach. Silas made an impatient sound, a low rumble in his throat that might have been frustration or might have been something else entirely. He stepped behind her and she tensed, waiting for roughness. But his fingers were surprisingly gentle as they worked the buttons free. One after another from her collar down to her waist, he unfastened them with the careful precision of a man used to handling delicate things. Not women, perhaps, but newborn animals, injured birds, the small, fragile creatures that lived and died in these brutal mountains. "Caroline used to make me do this," he said quietly, his breath warm on the back of her neck. "Said her fingers were too cold in winter to manage all these damn buttons." His voice caught on the name, Caroline, his dead wife, the woman Grace had been ordered through a mail catalog to replace. "I can manage from here," Grace whispered. Silas stepped back and she heard him move to the window. She was grateful for the moment of privacy, even if it was an illusion. They were husband and wife now. The law gave him rights over her body that no amount of modesty could protect. She let the dress fall and stepped out of it. Her fingers worked the corset laces with practiced efficiency. She had learned to dress and undress herself years ago in the convent, where asking for help meant depending on people who resented being depended on. The corset dropped. The petticoats followed, until she stood in nothing but her thin cotton chemise, her body outlined clearly in the lamplight. She was big. She had always been big. Tall and broad-shouldered, heavy-breasted, and thick-thighed in ways that made other women whisper behind their hands, and men look away in disappointment. At church socials back in Massachusetts, she had been the girl no boy wanted to dance with because she stood a full head taller than most of them. At her first wedding, her husband had looked at her with nervous awe, like a child confronting a horse he was not sure he could ride. At her second wedding, the man had seemed confident until he was not. And at her third wedding, her husband had barely looked at her at all. "I am ready," she said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake. Silas turned from the window. His eyes traveled down her body slowly, clinically, the way a rancher might assess livestock at auction. She waited for the disgust, the disappointment, the inevitable moment when he would realize he had made a terrible mistake ordering a bride sight unseen based on nothing but a brief letter and a blurry photograph she did not even have. But he just nodded. "Lie down on the bed, on your back." She did as he commanded. The quilt was rough beneath her shoulders, the mattress sagging in the middle from years of solitary sleep. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn logs, and she focused on counting them as Silas approached the bed. 5 logs. 6. 7. "Pull up your chemise," he said, "to your waist." Her hands fisted in the thin fabric. For a moment, she could not move. This was it. This was the moment every marriage came down to, the moment of revelation, of vulnerability, of truth. Benjamin had died before this moment. Horace had failed at this moment. Marcus had refused this moment entirely. What would Silas Thornwood do? She pulled the chemise up slowly, exposing her legs, her thighs, the most intimate parts of herself to this stranger who was now her husband. The cold air hit her skin, and she shivered, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling. 8 logs. 9. 10. Now open your legs, Silas said, and his voice had changed. There was a thickness to it now, a strain that had not been there before. Let me see. Grace closed her eyes and obeyed. She felt herself opening, exposing, offering up the last piece of privacy she had ever possessed. She waited for his hands. For the inevitable pain that everyone said came the first time. For the moment when this lonely mountain man would finally claim what 3 husbands before him had left untouched. But instead she heard him suck in a sharp breath. Then silence. Long, terrible silence that stretched across seconds like hours. She opened her eyes and found Silas Thornwood frozen at the foot of the bed. His face had gone pale in the lamplight, the rugged, weathered skin suddenly ashen. His hands were suspended in midair as if he had been about to reach for her, but something had stopped him cold. His eyes were fixed between her legs, but the expression on his face was not desire. It was not clinical interest. It was not even disgust. It was shock. Pure, absolute shock. You really were not lying, he whispered. You have never been touched. No, Wes. Grace's voice came out smaller than she intended. I told you in my letter. I told you I had not. Why would I lie about that? 3 marriages. Silas shook his head slowly like a man trying to wake himself from a strange dream. You have been married 3 times, and nobody ever... He trailed off, the words failing him. My first husband died of a heart attack on our wedding night before we could consummate. My second husband tried for 3 months and could not manage it. He said I was too big, too much woman, that my body was not made right for a man. Grace heard her voice cracking, but could not stop it. The doctors agreed when they examined me for the annulment. They said I had natural impediments. She sat up quickly, yanking her chemise back down, her face burning with shame that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. My third husband never tried at all, 'cause he was in love with someone else. A man. He only married me as a cover for what he really was. So yes, Mr. Thornwood, I am 29 years old and I have never been touched. I am sorry if that is disappointing. I am sorry if it means I am broken. But that is what you bought when you sent for a mail-order bride from the charity agency. A tall, ugly, broken woman that no one else wanted. She waited for him to order her out, to tell her to pack her single bag and walk back down the mountain in the snow. She had survived worse. She would survive this too. But Silas Thornwood did something she did not expect. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed, his back to her, his massive shoulders hunched forward. And when he spoke, his voice was not angry or disgusted. It was raw with something that sounded almost like anguish. Broken? His laugh was bitter, scraping against the cabin walls. Those doctors were either blind or they were lying to your husband's face. There is nothing wrong with you, Grace. Nothing at all. She blinked, confusion cutting through her shame. What? Silas turned to look at her over his shoulder, and his eyes were no longer cold or clinical. They were blazing with a fury that was not directed at her. I have helped birth calves and foals for 20 years. I know what anatomy is supposed to look like, both animal and human. There is no impediment in you, no abnormality, no defect. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. You are just intact, completely intact, which means your second husband was either impotent or a coward who blamed you for his own failings. And those doctors signed off on an annulment based on a lie because it was easier than admitting a man's weakness. Grace could not breathe. The room spun around her, the log ceiling tilting at strange angles. But Horace said the examination proved Horace was a liar. Silas stood and paced to the window, his breath fogging the cold glass. And I was about to be worse than him. He pressed his forehead against the window, staring out at the snow that fell silent and thick in the darkness. I was about to treat you like livestock, like a business transaction that needed verification, like property I needed to inspect before accepting delivery. His voice broke on the words. My wife Caroline would have been ashamed of me. She would have looked at me tonight and not recognized the man she married. Grace pulled the quilt up around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how cold the cabin had become. Or maybe the cold had always been there, and she was only now feeling it. Is that not what I am? She heard herself ask. You ordered a mail order bride. I came with a contract and a price. You have every legal right to verify what you paid for. Silas turned from the window, and she saw something in his face she had not seen all day. Something that looked almost like pain. Legal right does not make it moral grace. He crossed to the chair by the stove and sat down heavily, putting distance between them that felt like more than just feet and inches. You were terrified. I could see you shaking. I could see tears on your face even though you were trying to hide them. And you obeyed anyway, because 3 men before me taught you that your feelings do not matter. That your body is just something to be used or rejected based on whether it meets someone else's standards. He scrubbed his hands over his face, the rough sound of calluses against beard filling the silence. I lived alone in these mountains for 8 years after Caroline died. 8 years of nobody to talk to but horses and cattle and the wind. I forgot how to be human, Grace. I forgot that people have feelings. That women are not just functional objects. Grace watched him from the bed, the quilt clutched to her chest like armor. In all her years and all her marriages, no man had ever apologized to her. No man had ever acknowledged that she might have feelings worth considering. Your wife, she said quietly, Caroline. How did she die? The name seemed to hit Silas like a physical blow. He stared at the floor for a long moment before answering. Childbirth. The word came out rough, scraped raw by years of grief. Her and the baby both. I could not save them. Something shifted in Grace's chest, not quite sympathy, not quite understanding, but a recognition of pain that mirrored her own. I am sorry. Everyone is sorry. Silas looked up at her, and his eyes were red-rimmed in the lamplight. The doctor was sorry. The preacher was sorry. The neighbors were sorry, but sorry does not bring them back. Sorry does not make the cabin less empty. Sorry does not stop me from hearing her voice in my dreams begging me to save our baby. He stood abruptly and walked to the door, putting his hand on the latch. You can have the bed tonight. I will sleep in the barn with the horses. In the morning, we will talk about what happens next. Whether you want to stay or go, that will be your choice, not mine. Mr. Thornwood, he paused, his back still to her. Why did you send for a bride if you are not ready to be married again? Why did you write to the agency? Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I am 42 years old and I am tired of being alone. Because this ranch is failing and I need help I cannot afford to hire. Because I thought if I could not have love, I could at least have partnership. He opened the door, letting in a blast of frigid air. I was wrong to think I could treat another human being like a solution to my problems. You deserve better than that, Grace. You deserve better than me. He stepped out into the snow and closed the door behind him, leaving Grace alone in the cabin, with nothing but the dying fire and the echo of words no man had ever spoken to her before. You deserve better. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, counting the logs again. But this time she was not trying to escape from her body. She was trying to understand how her 4th wedding night had become the strangest and most unexpected of them all. Not because her husband had claimed her, but because he had refused to. The next morning came gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Grace woke to the sound of boots on the porch and the smell of coffee drifting through the cabin. Silas entered without knocking, stamping snow from his feet, his beard crusted with ice. He set a pot of coffee on the stove and began cracking eggs into a skillet, all without looking at her. Breakfast in 5 minutes, he said. We have 30 head of cattle to check fences to mend on the north pasture, and the barn roof has a leak that will bring the whole damn thing down if we get more snow. He finally glanced at her, his expression neutral, but not unkind. You said in your letter you could work. Time to prove it. No apology for last night, no awkwardness, just straight into business as if the moment of vulnerability between them had been sealed away behind the same walls he kept around everything else. Grace appreciated that more than she could say. She had had enough of men who made promises in the dark and forgot them by daylight. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks on plates, the only sound besides the wind howling around the cabin's corners. Grace watched Silas between bites, the way he moved with contained energy, like a man who had forgotten how to be still. When they finished, he pulled out a bundle of clothes from a chest by the door. Wool pants, a flannel shirt worn soft with age, a heavy coat with patches at the elbows. "Caroline's things will not fit you," he said gruffly, "but these are mine from before I've filled out. They should work well enough." Grace took the clothes and changed behind the curtain. The wool was rough against her skin, but warm. The pants fit better than any dress she had ever owned, allowing her legs to move freely. The coat hung loose on her shoulders, but covered her completely against the cold. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized herself. A tall, broad-shouldered figure who looked capable rather than apologetic. Someone who might belong in this harsh landscape instead of being crushed by it. Outside, the cold hit like a fist to the chest. Snow covered everything in white silence, broken only by the dark shapes of cattle clustered near the barn. Silas was already there, pitching hay with mechanical precision, his breath coming in white clouds. "Grab that pitchfork," he called when he saw her. "Cattle need feeding before we ride out to check the herd." Grace had mucked stables before, had helped with harvest. The crews had done every kind of back-breaking labor desperate women did to survive. But this was different. This was her work now, her responsibility, her future being built with every forkful of hay. She worked beside Silas in silence, matching his rhythm. And when he glanced over at her, she caught something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. "You were not lying about being able to work," he said after an hour when they had finished feeding and were saddling horses for the ride out to the pasture. "I do not lie," she said simply. "There is no point. The truth always comes out eventually." He stopped, his hands stilling on the saddle cinch. "No, I suppose it does." He looked at her across the horse's back. "Last night when you told me about your marriages. Did you tell me everything, or is there more truth waiting to come out?" Grace considered lying, considered protecting herself the way she had learned to do over years of disappointment. Then she remembered his words from the night before. "I can promise honesty." "There is more," she admitted. "Benjamin, my first husband, he was kind to me. But he was also 40 years older and needed a nurse more than a wife. His family paid me to marry him because they did not want to care for him themselves. When he died, they kept everything and gave me nothing." She stroked the horse's neck, not meeting Silas's eyes. "Horace married me because he thought my size meant I would be easy to control, that I would be grateful enough not to complain when he could not perform. When the doctors agreed to his lie about my supposed defects, he had me thrown out with nothing but the clothes on my back." Her voice hardened. "And Marcus married me to hide what he really was. When his secret came out, the scandal touched me too. No respectable family would hire me after that. The charity agency was my last option." She finally looked up at Silas. "So, yes, I can work, but I am also damaged goods, Mr. Thornwood. I come with scandal and failure and 3 families who wanted nothing to do with me. If you want to reconsider our arrangement, I will understand." "Stop." Silas came around the horse to stand in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to meet his eyes. "Stop apologizing for other people's failures. Stop calling yourself damaged because broken men could not see what they had." His voice was rough, but not unkind. "I told you last night I could not promise love, but I can promise I will not punish you for crimes you did not commit. You are here now, this is your home, and anyone who says different will answer to me." Something warm unfurled in Grace's chest, dangerous and frightening and too fragile to trust. But she nodded, not trusting her voice. They rode out together into the white silence of Montana winter. 2 damaged people looking for redemption in frozen ground and struggling cattle and the hard work of survival. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm as steady as heartbeats. Grace woke before dawn each day to the sound of Silas moving through the cabin, his heavy boots on the wooden floor, the scrape of the coffee pot against the stove. By the time she dressed and emerged from behind the curtain that now divided the sleeping area from the rest of the cabin, he was already outside, a dark figure against the white landscape, tending to animals that seemed perpetually on the edge of starvation. She joined him without being asked. They worked side by side for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, feeding cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs, mending fences that collapsed under the weight of snow, hauling hay from the barn to the pasture where the herd stood huddled against the wind. Grace's hands bled for the first week. Her back ached so badly some nights she could barely stand. But she did not complain. She had never complained. And slowly, day by day, her body adapted. Her hands grew calluses to match Silas's. Her shoulders grew stronger. Her lungs learned to breathe the thin mountain air without gasping. She was becoming someone new. Someone forged by this harsh landscape into something harder and more resilient than the woman who had stepped off the train at Bozeman Station. Silas noticed. He did not say much, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that was no longer surprise, but something closer to respect. "You work harder than any woman I have ever known," he said one evening as they sat by the fire too exhausted to do anything but stare at the flames. "Harder than most men." "I had to," Grace said simply. "No one was going to take care of me. I learned early that if I wanted to survive, I had to be useful." "Is that what you think you are, useful?" The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, trying to read his expression in the firelight. "Is that not what you wanted?" "Someone useful." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "I thought that was what I wanted. A worker, a partner, someone to help me save this ranch." He paused. "But I am beginning to think I wanted something else. Something I did not know how to ask for." What? He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw vulnerability behind the walls he kept so carefully maintained. Someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, someone to make this cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. He looked away quickly as if embarrassed by his own honesty. Caroline used to fill every silence with words. She talked about everything and nothing about the weather and the animals and the dreams she had for our future. After she died, the silence nearly drove me mad. I thought I had learned to live with it. But now that you are here, I realize I never did. I just learned to survive it. Grace felt something shift between them. Not attraction, not yet, but a recognition that they were more alike than either had realized. Two people who had learned to survive loneliness rather than live with it. "I talk to myself sometimes," she admitted. In the convent, it was the only way to hear a kind voice. The other sisters were not cruel exactly, but they were not kind either. Sister Marguerite was the only one who ever spoke to me like I was a person instead of a burden. "What happened to her?" "She died, the winter before I left." Grace stared into the fire. "She was the one who gave me money when they threw me out, pressed coins into my hand, and told me to go west where no one knew my past. I never got to thank her properly." "She sounds like a good woman." "She was the best woman I ever knew, the only one who ever believed I might be worth something." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly, "She was right." Grace looked at him, startled. "You are worth something, Grace. I do not know what the world taught you about yourself, but the world was wrong. I have watched you for 3 weeks now. I have seen you work until your hands bled without complaining. I have seen you gentle, nervous animals with just your voice. I have seen you stand at the window every sunset and look at these mountains like they were painted by God himself." He shook his head. "You are not worthless. You are not damaged. You are just someone who has never had anyone see you clearly. And that is the world's failure, not yours." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. She had cried so many tears in her life, but these were different. These were not tears of grief or shame or despair. They were tears of recognition, of being seen for the first time in 29 years. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded, looking uncomfortable with the emotion between them. "We should sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day." But as Grace lay in bed that night, listening to Silas's steady breathing from his chair by the fire, she knew something had changed. The cabin felt different now, warmer, less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. She was beginning to feel something she had never felt before. She was beginning to feel like she belonged. On Christmas Eve, 3 weeks after their wedding, Grace woke to find Silas gone from the cabin. His coat was still on its hook, his boots still by the door, but the chair where he read his Bible every night was empty. She found him in the barn, standing alone in a dark corner where the lamplight did not reach. He was staring at something covered by a dusty canvas tarp his massive shoulders shaking slightly in the cold. Or maybe not from the cold. Silas, he did not turn around, did not acknowledge her presence, but he did not tell her to leave either. I made this for my daughter. His voice came from somewhere far away, hollow and scraped raw. Spent 6 months getting the joints perfect, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. Carolyn would sit beside me in the evenings sewing blankets and singing hymns. She said our daughter would be born in spring when the wild roses bloom in the valley. We were going to name her Rose. He reached out and pulled the tarp away, revealing a cradle. Even in the darkness, Grace could see the craftsmanship, the delicate curves of the wood, the flowers carved into the headboard, the name Rose etched in flowing script along the side. She never got to use it, Silas whispered. Never even got to see it finished. Carolyn died on a February night, screaming my name, begging me to save them both. And I could not do a damn thing except watch them slip away. Grace moved closer, close enough to see the tears frozen on his beard. What happened? She asked softly. Silas was quiet for so long, she thought he would not answer. Then the words came slow and halting like blood from an old wound. It was the worst winter in 20 years. Snow piled higher than the roof. Wind so cold it could kill a man in minutes. Caroline went into labor 3 weeks early and something was wrong from the start. The baby was turned the wrong way. Caroline was bleeding too much. He pressed his hand against the cradle, his fingers tracing the carved roses. I rode through the blizzard to get the doctor. 4 hours to town, 4 hours back. But by the time we returned, it was too late. Caroline was already gone. The baby had never taken a breath. Grace felt her own eyes filling with tears. I buried them myself, Silas continued, dug 2 graves in the frozen ground with my own hands because the ground was too hard for anyone else to help. Put my wife in one hole and my daughter in another, and I have not been whole since. Silas. Grace reached out and touched his arm, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since their wedding. It was not your fault. Then whose fault was it? He turned to face her, and his eyes were wild with grief that had never healed. I should have taken her to town before the winter set in. I should have insisted she stay with the doctor's wife until the baby came. I should have been faster on that horse, should have pushed harder through the snow. Should have is not a question that has an answer, Grace said gently. I know I have asked it enough times myself. Silas looked at her, really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. What should have do you carry? Grace held his gaze. I should have been born different. Should have been the kind of woman men want to keep instead of the kind they discard. I should have fought harder when Elizabeth framed me at the convent. Should have refused to marry Benjamin when I knew his family only wanted a nursemaid. Should have seen through Horace's lies before he destroyed my reputation. Should have known Marcus was using me before the scandal ruined us both. She took a breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. But should have does not change what happened. It only makes the present harder to bear. Silas stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly the tension in his shoulders began to ease. How did you get so wise? I am not wise. I am just tired of being angry at things I cannot change. They stood together in the dark barn, 2 broken people surrounded by the ghosts of what they had lost. And when Silas reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers wrapping around hers, Grace did not pull away. I do not know how to stop missing her, he admitted. I do not know how to be anything but the man she left behind. Maybe you do not have to stop missing her. Maybe you just have to learn how to live anyway. Silas looked down at their joined hands, his and hers, 2 sets of work-roughened fingers interlocked in the darkness. I am scared, he said quietly. I am scared that if I let myself care about someone again, I will lose them too. I am scared that everything I touch turns to death and dust. I am scared that you will realize what a mess I am and leave, and I will be alone again with nothing but ghosts and regrets. I understand fear, Grace said softly. I have lived with it my whole life. The fear of being rejected, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of never being good enough for anyone. She squeezed his hand. But I am more scared of spending the rest of my life alone than I am of being hurt again. So I am choosing to stay, if you will let me. Silas lifted their joined hands and pressed them against his chest, against the place where his heart beat beneath layers of flannel and wool. Stay, he said. Not because of the contract or the law or because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because I am asking you to. Stay because I want you here. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had cried enough tears in her life. Tonight on Christmas Eve, standing in a coal barn beside a cradle that would never hold the child it was made for, she wanted to feel something other than grief. I will stay, she whispered. I choose to stay. They walked back to the cabin together, hands still joined, and when they reached the door, Silas paused. Tomorrow is Christmas. Caroline always made a special breakfast, eggs and bacon and biscuits with honey. His voice was rough. I have not made it since she died, but I thought maybe if you wanted, we could try to bring some of that back. I would like that, Grace said softly. I would like that very much. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they slept in the same room without the curtain between them. Silas still took the chair by the fire, insisting that Grace have the bed. But when she woke in the middle of the night, cold and disoriented, she saw him watching her from across the room. Not with desire, not with suspicion, with something that looked almost like hope. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at after weeks of gray clouds and falling snow. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of bacon sizzling in the pan. Silas stood at the stove, his back to her, and she watched him for a moment before announcing she was awake. He moved differently this morning. His shoulders were not quite so tense. His movements were not quite so rigid, as if something had thawed in him overnight. Merry Christmas, he said without turning around. Merry Christmas. They ate together at the small table, the first real meal they had shared since their wedding supper of beans and silence. The eggs were overcooked, and the bacon was too salty, but Grace did not care. It was the first time anyone had cooked for her in years. The first time anyone had tried to give her something simply because it was a holiday, and holidays deserve to be marked. Thank you, she said when they finished, for this, for everything. Silas nodded, then stood and crossed to the chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it and pulled out a bundle wrapped in plain brown paper. I ordered this months ago before I knew who would answer my advertisement. It was meant for whoever came. He handed her the bundle. But now it is for you. Grace unwrapped the paper carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside was a dress, deep green wool, finely stitched with mother-of-pearl buttons running down the bodice. It was simple but beautiful, the kind of dress a woman might wear to church on Sunday or to a dance on Saturday night. Silas, she breathed, this is too much. Try it on. His voice was gruff. I guessed at the size from your letter. It might not fit right. Grace took the dress behind the curtain and changed with shaking hands. The wool was soft against her skin, softer than anything she had worn since leaving the convent. The bodice fit perfectly across her broad shoulders, the waist sitting exactly where it should, the skirt falling to the floor with room to move. She stepped out from behind the curtain, and Silas turned to look at her. His breath caught. She heard it unmistakable, a sharp intake of air. It fits, she said suddenly, self-conscious. It more than fits. Silas's voice was strange, thick. You look beautiful, Grace. No one had ever called her beautiful before. Not her parents who had called her useful. Not the nuns who had called her dutiful. Not her husbands who had called her disappointing or defective or simply nothing at all. I am not, she started to say automatically. Stop. Silas crossed the room and took her hands in his. Stop telling yourself what other people said about you. Those people were wrong, blind or cruel or both but wrong. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. I have looked at your face every day for 3 weeks. I have watched you work harder than anyone I have ever known. I have seen you stand in front of mountains at sunset and look like you belong there, like you were carved from the same stone. His thumb brushed her cheek. You are beautiful, Grace Thornwood, and I will keep saying it until you believe me. Grace felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. Years of protection, years of armoring herself against disappointment and rejection, all of it trembling under the weight of this rough man's words. Why are you saying this? She whispered. What changed? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he released her chin and stepped back. Last night in the barn, you held my hand while I fell apart. You did not try to fix me, did not tell me to stop grieving, did not look at me with pity or disgust. You just stayed. He turned to look out the window at the snow-covered mountains. Caroline was the only person who ever stayed. When my father beat me, when my mother died, when everything fell apart, she stayed through all of it, and I thought when she died that no one would ever stay again. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. But you stayed. You chose to stay. And I cannot promise I will be good at this. I cannot promise I will not hurt you or disappoint you or retreat into my grief when the memories get too heavy. But I can promise that I will try. I will try to be the man you deserve. Grace crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Outside, the world was white and silent, a blank page waiting to be written. I do not need you to be perfect, Silas. I just need you to be honest. Can you promise me that, yes? He turned to face her. I can promise honesty. I can promise respect. I can promise that I will never touch you without your permission, never treat you like property, never make you feel like you are less than what you are. He held out his hand in offering rather than a demand. Partners. That is what I said I wanted in my letter. Someone to work beside me and share this life with me. Can you be that, Grace? Can you be my partner? Grace looked at his hand, at the calluses and scars and the years of hard labor written into his skin. Then she placed her hand in his. Partners, she agreed. We start there. Everything else we figure out as we go. Silas nodded, and for the first time since she had arrived in Montana, she saw him smile. It was small, barely more than a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, almost like the man he might have been before grief carved him hollow. Partners, he repeated. I think I can live with that. They stood together at the window as Christmas morning stretched golden across the mountains. Two strangers who had become something more. Not lovers, not yet, perhaps not ever, but partners, companions. Two people who had chosen each other not out of passion, but out of something rarer and perhaps more valuable, out of hope. Outside, the wind picked up swirling snow across the empty yard. Winter was far from over. The hardest months still lay ahead, months of cold and isolation, and the kind of struggle that broke weaker people. But Grace Ellen Whitmore had never been broken, no matter what the doctor said, no matter what her husbands believed. She had been bent and battered and bruised, but never broken. And standing beside Silas Thornwood in the cabin, they now shared watching the first Christmas snow fall soft and silent across the Montana wilderness. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. This time she had found someone who saw her. She did not know that spring would bring a reckoning, that a ghost from her past would ride into these mountains seeking to destroy everything she and Silas were building. That the peace of this Christmas morning was borrowed time, a calm before a storm that would test every promise they had made. She only knew that for the first time in 29 years she was not alone. And for now, that was enough. The weeks after Christmas melted into each other like snow under a February sun each day, bringing Grace and Silas closer to something neither of them had expected to find. They worked side by side from dawn until dark, their bodies moving in rhythms that grew more synchronized with each passing day. Silas taught Grace how to read the weather in the clouds, how to predict when a storm was coming, by the way the cattle bunched together, how to splint a broken leg on a calf and stitch a wound on a horse. Grace taught Silas how to laugh again, though neither of them would have called it that. She simply refused to let his silences swallow her whole, filling the cabin with hymns she had learned in the convent, and stories about the sisters who had been kind to her, and observations about the mountains that made him see his home through new eyes. You talk more than anyone I have ever met, Silas said one evening in late January, but there was no complaint in his voice, only wonder. You talk less than anyone I have ever met, Grace replied. Between the two of us, we might make one normal person. And Silas laughed, a real laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. It was the first time Grace had heard him laugh since she arrived, and the sound of it lodged somewhere deep in her chest and refused to leave. They did not touch each other during those weeks, not beyond the accidental brushing of hands when passing tools, or the necessary contact of helping each other with heavy loads. But the space between them grew warmer, more charged. Grace found herself watching Silas when he was not looking, noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he swung an axe, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, when something amused him, the way he said her name like it was a word he was just learning to pronounce. Silas watched her too. He was less subtle about it than he thought, his dark eyes following her across the cabin, lingering on her face in the firelight, like he was trying to memorize every line. They were falling in love, slowly, carefully, the way two wounded animals approach each other in the wilderness, neither willing to make the first move, neither willing to admit what was happening, until the night of the storm. It came without warning in late March, when the first hints of spring had begun to show in the lengthening days and the occasional patch of bare ground where the snow had melted. Grace had allowed herself to hope that the worst was over, that they would slide gently into warmer weather and easier work. She should have known better. Montana did not give up winter without a fight. The blizzard hit just after midnight, roaring down from the mountains with a fury that shook the cabin to its foundations. Grace woke to the sound of wind screaming through the cracks in the walls and Silas already pulling on his boots. "The cattle," he said, his voice tight with fear. "The new calves. They will freeze if we do not get them to shelter." They fought their way through the storm together, the snow so thick Grace could barely see Silas, even though he was only feet ahead of her. The temperature had dropped so fast that the air itself seemed to crystallize each breath like swallowing broken glass. They found the herd huddled against the north fence, 30 head of cattle and 15 newborn calves, their bodies already covered in ice. For the next 6 hours, Grace and Silas worked in a kind of desperate dance, hauling calves into the barn, breaking ice off mothers' faces, piling hay and blankets, and anything else they could find to keep the animals warm. By dawn, they had saved 12 of the 15 calves. 3 small bodies lay still in the snow, too young and too weak to survive the cold. Grace knelt beside one of them, a tiny heifer with a white star on her forehead, and felt tears freeze on her cheeks. "I am sorry," she whispered to the dead calf. "I am so sorry we could not save you." But before she could grieve further, a sound cut through the dying wind. A high, desperate whinny from inside the barn. Silas's head snapped up. "Bessie!" They ran. Bessie was Silas's mare, the horse he had raised from a foal, the one he talked to more than he talked to people. She was also 8 months pregnant, and as they burst through the barn doors, Grace saw immediately that something was terribly wrong. The mare was down on her side, her flanks heaving, her eyes rolling with pain and fear. Fluid pooled beneath her, and her legs kicked weakly at the air. "No," Silas dropped to his knees beside her. "No, no, no, not now. It is too early. She is not due for another month." His hands ran over the mare's belly and his face went pale. "The foal is turned wrong. I can feel it. The legs are not positioned right." He looked at Grace with desperation in his eyes. "I have seen this before. If we do not turn the foal, they will both die." "Can you do it?" Silas held up his hands. They were massive, scarred, calloused from decades of hard work. "My hands are too big. I cannot reach far enough without hurting her." His voice cracked. "I tried once before with another mare. I tore her inside. She bled to death in front of me." Grace looked at the suffering horse, then at her own hands. They were large for a woman, broad and strong from months of ranch work. But they were smaller than Silas's. "Tell me what to do." Silas stared at her. "Grace, you have never done this before. If something goes wrong, then we will lose them both anyway." She knelt beside the mare, rolling up her sleeves. "I helped birth goats at the convent. Sister Marguerite taught me. It cannot be so different. It is different. Horses are bigger, more delicate inside than you would think. Then guide me." She met his eyes steadily. "Tell me what to do, Silas. I am not going to let her die without trying." For a long moment he did not move. She could see the war playing out on his face, the terror of the past battling with the desperate hope of the present. Then he nodded. "All right, come here, let me show you." The next hour was the longest of Grace's life. Silas talked her through every step, his voice low and steady, even though his hands were shaking. Grace reached inside the mare, feeling for the foal, her fingers searching for legs that were folded the wrong way. "There," Silas said when she found them. "You need to push the foal back first. Give yourself room to work. Then unfold the front legs and position them toward the birth canal." The mare groaned and kicked, and Grace had to brace herself against the powerful muscles that contracted around her arm. "Easy, girl," she murmured, the same way she had murmured to frightened goats in the convent barn. "Easy. I know it hurts, but I am trying to help you." Slowly, carefully she worked, pushing, turning, feeling for the delicate bones of legs and the curve of a tiny skull. Her arm ached, her shoulder screamed, but she did not stop. I think I have it, she gasped finally. The legs are positioned now. I can feel the hooves pointing the right way. Good. Now pull. Gently at first, then harder when she pushes. Work with her, not against her. Grace pulled. The mare pushed. And after an eternity that lasted only minutes, a wet, dark shape slid out onto the hay. A foal, small and perfect, its sides heaving with its first breaths. It is alive, Grace breathed. Silas, it is alive. Silas was beside her in an instant, clearing the foal's nostrils, rubbing its body with clean straw to stimulate circulation. The little creature lifted its head and let out a thin, wavering whinny. Bessie raised her head too, nickering softly to her baby. Already she was trying to stand to get to her foal, to begin the ancient dance of mother and child. Grace sat back on her heels, her arm covered in blood and fluid, her whole body trembling with exhaustion. But she was smiling, smiling so wide her face hurt. You did it, Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. Grace, you saved them both. We did it, she corrected. I could not have done it without you telling me what to do. Silas looked at her, then really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart stop. It was not just gratitude. It was not just relief. It was love. Grace, he said, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her against his chest, not caring that they were both covered in blood and sweat and the mess of new life. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I know I said I could not promise that. I know I said I did not have it in me anymore. But I was wrong. I love you, Grace Thornwood. I have loved you since the night you held my hand in the barn and did not try to fix me. Grace pulled back just enough to look at him, this rough mountain man with tears on his cheeks and hay in his beard. I love you too, she whispered. I did not think I could. I did not think I had it left in me after everything. But I do. I love you, Silas. He kissed her then for the first time, his lips warm against hers despite the cold. It was not a gentle kiss, not a careful kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief and years of loneliness finally breaking apart. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. I want to make you my wife in truth, he said quietly. Not because of contracts or laws or anything else. Because I love you and I want you. And I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Silas, you should know that I have never, that no man has ever. I know. He kissed her forehead gently. I know, Grace. And we will go as slow as you need, tonight or tomorrow or a year from now, whenever you are ready. She thought about all the nights she had lain awake fearing this moment, the wedding nights that had ended in death and failure and abandonment, the doctors who had told her she was defective, the husbands who had made her believe she was unworthy of love. And then she thought about Silas, about the way he looked at her, about the way he touched her, about the way he had spent 4 months proving that he was a man who kept his promises. Tonight, she said, and her voice only trembled a little. I want it to be tonight, not because I am not afraid, but because I am tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. Silas kissed her again, softer, this time more tender. Tell me if anything hurts. Tell me if you want to stop. You are in control here, Grace, not me. And so on a cold March night in a barn that smelled of hay and horses and new life, Grace, Ellen Whitmore Thornwood, finally learned what it meant to be loved. It was not what she had expected, not the pain and violence she had been warned about, not the cold clinical procedure Horace had attempted, not the humiliation and rejection she had come to associate with the marriage beds. It was gentle. It was patient. It was Silas watching her face for any sign of discomfort, asking her over and over if she was all right, stopping every time she tensed and waiting until she relaxed again before continuing. When it was over, when they lay tangled together under horse blankets, with the newborn foal sleeping nearby and its mother standing guard, Grace felt something she had never felt before. Whole. I love you, Silas whispered against her hair. I love you, Grace Thornwood. Not because you work hard, or because you are useful, or because you fill an empty space. I love you because you are brave and honest and kind, despite every reason you have not to be. I love you because when I look at you, I do not just see my present, I see my future. Grace's tears soaked into his chest, but they were not tears of sadness. I love you too, she whispered back. I never thought I would say that to anyone. But I do. I love you so much it terrifies me. Then we will be terrified together, Silas said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. We will be scared and damaged and struggling and alive. We will build this ranch back up. We will survive winters and droughts and whatever else Montana throws at us. And maybe someday, if you want, we will fill that cradle in the barn with a child who knows they were wanted. Grace lifted her head to look at him. You really want that, a family with me? With you, he confirmed. Only with you. You are not my second choice, Grace. You are the best decision I ever made. She kissed him again, and this time there was no desperation, no fear, just the quiet certainty of two people who had found home in each other. Spring arrived in earnest over the following weeks, melting the last of the snow and painting the hillsides with wildflowers. Grace woke each morning to birdsong instead of howling wind, to the smell of green growing things instead of frost and ice. She had never been happier in her life. She and Silas worked together to repair the damage winter had done to the ranch. New fences went up, the barn roof got patched, a small vegetable garden took shape behind the cabin rows of beans and squash and corn that Grace tended with the same care she had once given to the convent's herb garden. The foal they had saved, a filly they named Hope, grew stronger every day. She followed Grace around the barnyard like a puppy, nuzzling her pockets for treats and whinnying when she walked away. She thinks you are her mother, Silas observed one afternoon watching Grace brush the young horse's coat. Someone has to be, Grace replied with a smile. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains golden rose. Silas would hold her hand, and sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, two people who no longer needed words to understand each other. I never thought I would have this, Grace said one evening in early April. A home, someone who loves me, a life that feels like it belongs to me instead of something I am borrowing until it gets taken away. Silas squeezed her hand. It will not get taken away, I promise you that. But promises Grace had learned were easy to make and hard to keep, and the past had a way of finding you no matter how far you ran. It came on a mild April morning when Grace was alone in the cabin and Silas was out checking the far pastures. She heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching and assumed it was one of the neighbors, perhaps Widow Benson from town, or one of the ranchers who occasionally stopped by to trade news and gossip. She stepped out onto the porch with a smile on her face. The smile died the moment she saw who was sitting on the horse in her yard. Horace Pemberton looked older than she remembered, his once handsome face now lined and puffy, his expensive clothes dusty from travel. But his eyes were the same, cold, cruel, the eyes of a man who enjoyed causing pain. Grace, my darling, he said, his voice slick as oil. I have been looking everywhere for you. Grace's blood turned to ice in her veins. What are you doing here? Is that any way to greet your husband? Horace dismounted, his boots crunching on the dirt as he walked toward her. I must say you have done well for yourself. This is quite the little homestead. You are not my husband. Grace forced the words out through a throat that had gone tight with fear. The marriage was annulled, you know that. Annulled on the basis of a medical condition that does not exist. Horace smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. I know the truth now, Grace. I know you were never defective, which means the annulment was based on fraud, which means, legally speaking, you are still my wife. That is not true. Is it not? Horace pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. I have a lawyer who says otherwise. A very expensive lawyer who assures me that if I press my claim, I can have your current marriage declared invalid. After all, a woman cannot be married to two men at once. Grace felt the porch railing behind her and gripped it to keep from falling. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? You did not want me. You said I was too big, too much, that my body was not made right. I said a lot of things. Horace stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. But I have had time to think since then. Time to realize that a woman like you could be useful. His eyes traveled down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. Your husband has land, Horace continued. Good land, valuable land. I want it, and you are going to help me get it. I will never help you. You will if you do not want to see him destroyed. Horace released her chin and stepped back. his smile widening. I have money. I have connections. I have a lawyer who can tie your precious mountain man up in court for years, drain every cent he has, take everything he owns. I can ruin him, Grace, the same way I ruined you. He turned and walked back to his horse. Think about my offer. I will return in 3 days for your answer. If you agree to sign over your rights to this land and come back to Denver with me, I will leave your husband in peace. If you refuse, he shrugged. Well, I am sure the court system in Montana Territory is very fair and efficient. He rode away without looking back, leaving Grace standing on the porch with her heart pounding and her world crumbling around her. She was still standing there when Silas returned an hour later. He took one look at her face and was off his horse in seconds, his hands gripping her shoulders. Grace, what happened? What is wrong? She told him everything. Horace's visit, his threats, the claim that their marriage could be invalidated, the ultimatum he had delivered with a smile. When she finished, Silas was silent for a long moment. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his beard. His hands, still on her shoulders, were trembling with barely contained rage. He threatened you, Silas said, finally, his voice low and dangerous. He came onto my land, into my home, and he threatened my wife. Silas, please. He has money. He has lawyers. If we fight him, he could destroy everything you have built. Let him try. Silas pulled her against his chest and held her tight. I did not survive 8 years alone in these mountains to lose everything now. I did not find you against all odds just to let some rich coward take you away from me. He pulled back and looked into her eyes. We will fight this, Grace. Together. And we will win. How can we possibly win against someone like Horace? Silas smiled grimly. Because we have something he does not. We have the truth, and we have friends. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. Silas rode to town and returned with Father Cornelius Ashby, widow Harriet Benson, and Dr. Samuel Crawford. He explained the situation, and one by one they pledged their support. I knew that man was trouble the moment I heard his name, widow Benson declared. Anyone who would blame his wife for his own failures is not fit to be called a man at all. Father Ashby nodded solemnly. I performed your wedding ceremony myself. It was valid in the eyes of the law. No amount of legal maneuvering can change that. But it was Dr. Crawford who offered the most crucial help. The annulment in Denver was based on a medical report that claimed Mrs. Thornwood had physical impediments preventing consummation, he said, studying the copy of the annulment papers Silas had obtained. But I examined Mrs. Thornwood myself at her request. There are no such impediments. The original report was either fraudulent or grossly incompetent. He looked at Grace with kind eyes. If you are willing to testify, I will provide a counter-report, and I will swear under oath that the original diagnosis was false. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. You would do that for me. I would do that for the truth, Mrs. Thornwood, and for justice. When Horace returned 3 days later, he brought a man with him, a slick-haired lawyer named Victor Crane who carried a leather valise stuffed with legal documents and wore a smile that made Grace's skin crawl. But this time Grace and Silas were not alone. Father Ashby stood on the porch with them. Dr. Crawford waited inside with his medical report. And down by the barn, several neighboring ranchers had gathered men who had known Silas for years and who had come to show their support. Horace's smug expression faltered when he saw the crowd. What is this? This is my home, Silas said calmly. These are my neighbors, and that woman standing beside me is my wife. Legally, morally, and in every other way that matters. Victor Crane stepped forward. Mr. Thornwood, my client has a legitimate claim. Your client has nothing. Dr. Crawford emerged from the cabin holding a stack of papers. I am Dr. Samuel Crawford, licensed physician in Montana Territory. I have examined Mrs. Thornwood and can confirm that the medical report used to justify her annulment from Mr. Pemberton was either fraudulent or grossly negligent. He handed the papers to Crane. Furthermore, I have been in contact with the Medical Board of Colorado regarding Dr. Reginald Marsh, who wrote the original report. He has been under investigation for years for providing false diagnoses in exchange for payment. Horace's face went pale. This is preposterous. This is the truth, Father Ashby interrupted. Something you seem to have little acquaintance with Mr. Pemberton. I married Silas and Grace myself. Their union is valid. Crane flipped through the papers, his smile cracking. He leaned over and whispered something in Horace's ear. Horace's face went from pale to red. "This is not over," he spat. "I will take this to court. You will leave my property." Silas's voice was calm, but his eyes were steel. "You have 10 seconds before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. You cannot prove harassment." "I have witnesses." Silas gestured to the ranchers by the barn. 12 of them, all willing to testify that you came here, threatened my wife, and tried to extort us. Horace looked around at the assembled crowd, at the hard-faced men and women who had gathered to support their neighbors. Whatever he saw in their eyes must have convinced him that this was not a battle he could win today. "Fine." He turned and stalked back to his horse. "Keep your pathetic ranch, but this is not over." He mounted and rode away, Victor Crane following behind him. But Grace knew Horace Pemberton. She knew he would not give up so easily. And she was right. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a courier from Helena. A formal lawsuit filed in the territorial court. Horace Pemberton versus Grace Whitmore Thornwood and Silas Thornwood, claiming fraud, bigamy, and damages in the amount of $5,000. "He cannot win," Grace said, but her voice wavered. "Dr. Crawford's report proves the annulment was valid." "He does not need to win." Silas set the letter down on the table. "He just needs to drag this out long enough to destroy us. Court fees, legal expenses, time away from the ranch during the busiest season." Grace pressed her hand against her stomach, which had begun to round slightly in the past few weeks. She had not told Silas yet. She had been waiting for the right moment. But now there might not be a right moment. "Silas," she said quietly, "there is something I need to tell you." He looked at her, concern in his eyes. "I am going to have a baby." Silas went very still. His eyes dropped to her stomach, then rose back to her face. "You mean—" "Dr. Crawford confirmed it last week when he came about the lawsuit. I was going to tell you that night, but then the letter came and—" She did not get to finish. Silas swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, his face transformed with joy. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "Silas, the lawsuit, Horace, everything is falling apart." "Nothing is falling apart." He set her down gently, his hands cupping her face. "Everything is coming together. Do you not see? This is what we have been fighting for. This is why we cannot let Horace win." He kissed her forehead. "We are going to Helena. We are going to face this head on, and we are going to win. For us, for our child, for our future." Grace looked into his eyes and saw something she had never seen before in any man who claimed to love her. Certainty. "Together?" she asked. "Together." The journey to Helena took 4 days by wagon, 4 days of rutted roads and cold nights, and Grace's stomach churning with both morning sickness and fear. Silas drove the horses with grim determination, speaking little but holding her hand whenever the road was smooth enough to allow it. They arrived in Helena on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty and exhausted. The territorial capital was larger than Grace had expected, a bustling town of brick buildings and wooden sidewalks. They found lodging at a modest boarding house near the courthouse and spent that first night lying awake in a narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Silas said in the darkness, "remember that I love you. Remember that nothing they say can change what we have." "I know." Grace pressed closer to him. "I know." The courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns designed to intimidate anyone who approached it. Grace felt her courage faltering as they climbed the steps, her hand gripping Silas's arm. The courtroom was smaller than she had imagined, a wood-paneled room with rows of benches and a raised platform where the judge would sit. Horace Pemberton was already there, seated at a table on the left with Victor Crane beside him. He looked confident, polished, like a man who knew he held all the cards. Grace and Silas took their places at the table on the right. They had no lawyer. They could not afford one. They had only each other and the truth. Judge Nathaniel Stone entered precisely at 9 o'clock. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "This court is now in session. The matter before us is Pemberton versus Thornwood, a civil complaint alleging fraud, bigamy, and seeking damages. Mr. Crane, present your case." Victor Crane rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client Horace Pemberton was legally married to the defendant Grace Whitmore in Denver, Colorado in 1875. That marriage was annulled on the basis of a medical report claiming Mrs. Whitmore had physical impediments preventing consummation. He paused for effect. We now have evidence that this medical report was fraudulent, which means the annulment was invalid, which means Mrs. Whitmore was still legally married to my client when she entered into marriage with Silas Thornwood. This constitutes bigamy. Grace felt Silas tense beside her. Furthermore, Crane continued, Mrs. Whitmore deceived Mr. Thornwood by failing to disclose her marital status. My client seeks damages of $5,000 in a declaration that the Thornwood marriage is null and void. Judge Stone nodded. You have evidence. We do. I would like to call Horace Pemberton to the stand. Horace took the witness stand with the air of a man about to deliver a performance. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and launched into a story that bore almost no resemblance to reality. He spoke of his beloved wife, Grace, of their happy marriage that was tragically cut short by her medical condition. He described his devastation at the annulment and his shock at discovering she had remarried. Grace listened with growing horror. Every word was a lie, but Horace told them with such conviction that she could almost believe them herself. When Crane finished, Judge Stone turned to Silas. Mr. Thornwood, you have no legal representation. Do you wish to question the witness? Silas stood slowly, his massive frame filling the small courtroom. I do, Your Honor. He walked toward the witness stand, and Grace saw Horace shift uncomfortably. Mr. Pemberton, you described your marriage to my wife as happy, is that correct? Yes, we were very happy. Then why did you seek an annulment? Horace's smile flickered. As I explained, she had medical problems. That is not what I asked, Silas cut him off. Why did you, a man who claims to have been happily married, want to end that marriage? Horace glanced at Crane. I was advised by doctors that the marriage could never be consummated. I had no choice. So you wanted children, that was important to you. Of course, every man wants children. Silas nodded. And in the 3 months of your marriage, you attempted to consummate it. Horace's face reddened. Yes, of course. How many times? I do not see how that is relevant. Your Honor, Silas turned to the judge. I believe it is very relevant. Mr. Pemberton claims my wife had physical impediments. I have medical testimony that says otherwise. If Mr. Pemberton never successfully consummated the marriage, the question is why? Judge Stone leaned forward. The question is allowed. Mr. Pemberton, please answer. We attempted several times. How many? Perhaps a dozen. And each time you were unable to complete the act. Because of her condition. One doctor confirmed that condition, Silas said. Dr. Reginald Marsh of Denver. The same Dr. Marsh who is currently under investigation by the Colorado Medical Board for providing false diagnoses in exchange for payment. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Judge Stone rapped his gavel. Order, Mr. Thornwood, do you have evidence of this investigation? I do, Your Honor. Silas returned to his table and picked up a stack of papers. Correspondence from the Colorado Medical Board confirming that Dr. Marsh has been the subject of multiple complaints. I also have a medical report from Dr. Samuel Crawford of Elkhorn, who examined my wife and found no impediments whatsoever. He handed the papers to the bailiff. Furthermore, I have a statement from Dr. Crawford indicating that the original report was either grossly negligent or deliberately fraudulent. Judge Stone studied the papers. When he looked up, his expression had changed. There was coldness in his eyes now directed at Horace. Mr. Pemberton, these documents suggest that the medical report may have been falsified. Do you have any response? Horace was sweating now. Your Honor, I relied on medical professionals. If Dr. Marsh made errors, you cannot be held responsible for the lies you paid for. Everyone turned to look at Grace. She had not realized she was standing. You told me I was broken, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. You told me my body was wrong. You made me believe I was defective, that no man would ever want me. She stepped toward the witness stand. But you knew the truth, did you not? Horace, you knew the problem was never me. It was you. You could not perform as a husband, so you paid a doctor to say it was my fault. You destroyed my reputation, my future, my belief in myself, all because you could not admit your own weakness. That is a lie. Horace jumped to his feet. You were always too much, too tall, too big, too everything. No normal man could. He stopped realizing what he had just admitted. The courtroom went silent. Judge Stone set down the papers. Mr. Pemberton, you have just admitted under oath that your inability to consummate your marriage was due to your own feelings, not any medical condition. This directly contradicts your earlier testimony. Horace's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Furthermore, the judge continued, the evidence suggests that you knowingly procured a fraudulent medical report. This is grounds to dismiss your lawsuit and potentially grounds for criminal charges. He turned to Crane. Counselor, advise your client that he is in serious trouble. Crane was already gathering his papers. Judge Stone stood. It is the finding of this court that the annulment between Horace Pemberton and Grace Whitmore was obtained through fraud. However, given that both parties believed the annulment to be valid at the time the subsequent marriage between Grace and Silas Thornwood was entered into in good faith. He looked directly at Grace and Silas. The marriage between Silas Thornwood and Grace Thornwood is hereby declared valid and legally binding. The complaint filed by Horace Pemberton is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Pemberton is ordered to pay all court costs and a fine of $500. Grace felt her knees buckle. Silas caught her. Furthermore, Judge Stone continued, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for investigation into potential charges of fraud and perjury against Mr. Pemberton. Sheriff, ensure that Mr. Pemberton does not leave Helena until the prosecutor reviews the evidence. Two deputies moved toward Horace. This is not over, he snarled. I will appeal. Mr. Pemberton, Judge Stone's voice cut through his protests. I strongly advise you to stop talking. They led Horace away, his threats fading as the doors closed behind him. Grace stood in the middle of the courtroom, Silas's arms around her. She should have felt humiliated having her darkest secrets exposed in public. Instead, she felt free. For the first time in her life, she had told her truth and been believed. Let us go home, Silas murmured against her hair. Let us go home and start our new life. Grace nodded, unable to speak. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright May sunshine, leaving behind the past that had haunted her for so long. The summer of 1879 was the happiest of Grace's life. Her belly grew round with the child inside her, and Silas treated her like she was precious beyond measure. He would not let her lift anything heavy. He rubbed her feet when they swelled. He talked to her stomach every night, telling their unborn child stories about the mountains and the life that waited for them. The ranch thrived. The cattle grew fat on rich grass. The vegetable garden produced more than they could eat. Neighbors came by regularly now to check on Grace's pregnancy and offer support. You have become quite popular, Silas observed one afternoon after Widow Benson departed with a jar of Grace's blackberry jam. I think they just like you more now that you smile sometimes, Grace replied. She had friends now, real friends who sought her company because they enjoyed her presence. It was a gift she had never expected to receive. Autumn came early, painting the mountainsides gold and crimson. Grace was enormous now, her belly so large she could barely see her feet. Dr. Crawford rode up every 2 weeks to check on her. Everything looks perfect, he reported. The baby is positioned well. I see no reason to expect complications. But Grace saw the shadow that crossed Silas's face every time the doctor spoke. She knew he was thinking of Caroline. It will not happen again, she told him one evening. I am not Caroline. This is different. I know. But his voice was not convincing. Silas. She took his hand and placed it on her belly where the baby was kicking. Feel that. That is your child, alive and strong. We are going to be fine. He pressed his palm against her stomach. I am trying to believe that. But every time I think about the birth, I see her face. I hear her screaming. Grace leaned against him. Dr. Crawford has agreed to come up before my time. He will bring a midwife. We will have help. This time will be different. I do not deserve you, Silas said quietly. Probably not. Grace agreed and felt him smile against her hair. The first snow of winter fell on November 15th. 3 days later, Grace's labor began. It started in the early hours of the morning, a deep cramping pain that pulled her from sleep. She lay still for a moment, breathing through it. When another wave came 20 minutes later, she knew. Silas. She shook his shoulder. It is time. He was out of bed in seconds. I will get Dr. Crawford. There is no time. Grace gripped his hand as another contraction hit. The baby is coming now. Silas's eyes were wild with fear. Grace, I cannot. What if something goes wrong? Silas. She waited until he met her eyes. I need you. Our baby needs you. You can do this. For a long moment, he did not move. She could see the terror of the past battling with the needs of the present. Then he took a deep breath and nodded. Tell me what to do. The next several hours were a blur of pain and effort, in Silas's steady voice guiding her through each contraction. He had helped deliver animals. He knew the process. And Grace trusted him more than she had ever trusted anyone. The sun was setting when the baby finally came sliding into Silas's waiting hands, with a cry that filled the cabin with new life. A girl, Silas breathed, his voice breaking. Grace, we have a daughter. He placed the baby on her chest, and Grace looked down at the tiny red-faced creature who was already rooting for her breast. Hello, little one, she whispered. Hello, my darling girl. Silas knelt beside the bed, one hand on Grace's shoulder, one hand on the baby's back, his face wet with tears. What should we call her? Grace had thought about this for months. But now, looking at her daughter, only one name felt right. Martha Rose, she said, for the wife you loved and the daughter you lost, so they will never be forgotten. Silas made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Martha Rose Thornwood, it is perfect. He kissed Grace's forehead, then the baby's head. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for giving me a reason to hope again. Thank you for seeing me, Grace replied. Thank you for making me believe I was worth loving. Dr. Crawford arrived the next morning. He found Grace and baby both healthy, Silas exhausted but radiantly happy. You did well, the doctor told Silas. Better than many trained physicians. Silas shook his head. I was terrified. If Grace had not talked me through it, that is what makes it impressive. Acting despite fear is courage. The years that followed were not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken fences, prices that fell and costs that rose. There were nights when Silas retreated into grief, when the anniversary of Caroline's death pulled him back into darkness. There were days when Grace still heard Horace's voice telling her she was too much. But they faced each challenge together. They built the ranch into something larger, something that could sustain future generations. They filled the cabin with laughter and love and more children. Samuel came 2 years after Martha Rose, a sturdy boy with his father's dark eyes. Then Caroline, named for the woman Silas had loved, firstborn with red hair and a gentle spirit. Then Benjamin, whose smile made everything worthwhile. And finally, little Grace, who arrived when her mother was 42 and surprised everyone. 5 children, 5 miracles, 5 reasons to keep building, keep fighting, keep believing. The cradle Silas had made for Rose all those years ago was finally used. Used and used again, its rails worn smooth by tiny hands, its carved roses touched by 5 different children. But they knew the stories. Silas told them about Caroline and Rose, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him. Grace told them about the convent, about the 3 marriages that failed, about the moment their father chose tenderness over entitlement. She told them because she wanted them to know that strength was not something you were born with. It was something you built one painful day at a time. The spring of 1909 arrived mild and early, melting the snow and coaxing the wildflowers into bloom. Silas Thornwood, now 73 years old, sat on the porch of the large house he had built watching his grandchildren play in the yard. His beard was white, his back bent by decades of labor, but his eyes were still sharp. Beside him sat Grace, 60 years old, her hair streaked with silver. She was knitting a blanket for the newest grandchild, the one Martha Rose was expecting. Do you remember the night we met? Silas asked. Grace smiled without looking up. You mean the night you ordered me to undress and then stood there frozen when I obeyed? I was not expecting you. The height, the courage, the way you looked at me like you could see through all my walls. I could see a man who was lonely and afraid and pretending to be neither. Grace set down her knitting and took his hand. I could see a man who needed someone to stay. And you stayed. I stayed. Down in the yard, their grandchildren played some complicated game with sticks and rocks. Martha Rose, now 29, stood nearby, one hand on her pregnant belly. She looked so much like Grace had at that age, tall and broad-shouldered. But where Grace had learned to see her size as a burden, Martha Rose had been raised to see it as a gift. That was perhaps Grace's greatest legacy. Not the ranch or the children or the community they had helped build, but the way she had broken the cycle of shame. Her daughters knew they were enough. Her granddaughters would know it too. Grandpa, the youngest grandchild, 5-year-old Thomas, ran up the steps. Tell us a story. Silas lifted the boy onto his lap. What kind? The one about how you met Grandma. Silas and Grace exchanged a look that held 30 years of shared history. Well, Silas said, that is not quite how the stories tell it, but the important parts are true. What are the important parts? Silas looked out at the land he had built, the family he had raised. The important part is that your grandmother came to me when I had given up hope. She came broken by the world the same way I was broken. And instead of breaking each other further, we chose to heal together. He looked at Grace. The important part is that she saw me, really saw me. Not the mountain man who scared people. Not the widower who had buried his heart. She saw the man I could become if someone believed in me enough to stay. Thomas considered this seriously. So it was not love at first sight? No, Grace answered, smoothing the boy's hair. It was something better. It was love that grew from respect and partnership and the choice to face hard things together. Is that why you have been married so long? That is exactly why. Silas hugged his grandson close. And someday I hope you find someone who sees you the way your grandmother saw me. Someone who stays not because it is easy, but because you are worth staying for. The sun began to set, painting the mountains golden rose. The grandchildren were gathered by their parents, herded toward home. Soon the porch was quiet. Silas, Grace said as the stars began to emerge. Yes. Do you ever regret it, the way we started? Silas turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his life. I regret the years before you. I regret every day I spent alone when I could have been searching for you. He lifted her hand to his lips. But I have never, not for one moment, regretted you. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I used to pray for someone to want me, she said quietly. All those years in the convent, all those failed marriages. And then you came along, a man who ordered a wife like supplies, who froze in horror on our wedding night. She laughed softly. And somehow that man turned out to be the answer to every prayer. I was not much of an answer in the beginning. No, you were rough and cold, but you were honest and willing to try. That turned out to be enough. They sat in silence as the last light faded, two old people who had once been young and broken. Grace, yes. Thank you for staying, for fighting, for loving me when I did not know how to love myself. Grace squeezed his hand. Thank you for seeing me, for looking past everything the world said I was. You were always that person. You just needed someone to believe it. So did you. The night settled around them, soft and quiet and full of stars. Somewhere distant, a wolf howled, and on the porch of the house they had built together, surrounded by the legacy of children and grandchildren, Silas and Grace Thornwood held hands and watched the darkness fill with light. They had started as strangers, mail-order bride and lonely mountain man thrown together by desperation. They had become partners, workers and builders and survivors. They had become lovers, finding in each other the healing neither had dared to hope for. And now, at the end of their journey, they had become something more. They had become home, not a place but a person, not a building but a bond. The knowledge that no matter what storms came, they would never face the darkness alone. Grace closed her eyes and leaned against Silas's shoulder. She was 60 years old. She had been abandoned by family, cast out of a convent, failed by 3 husbands. She had traveled across a continent with nothing but a carpet bag and desperate hope. And she had found everything. Love, family, purpose, home. Not because she was beautiful by the world's standards, but because one man, one lonely mountain man with his own scars had looked at her and seen something worth loving. Because he had stayed. Because they both had. I love you, Silas Thornwood, she murmured. I love you too, Grace Thornwood. His arm tightened around her, today and tomorrow and every day after that, until the mountains crumble and the stars fall. Grace smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. Some loves were born in a moment, but the best loves, the truest loves, were built, day by day, choice by choice, through hardship and joy. She had built that love with this man, had watched it grow from a cold arrangement into a passion that still surprised her after 30 years. And as she sat on the porch of their home watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking of the children and grandchildren who would carry their story forward, Grace Ellen Whitmore, Thornwood finally understood the truth she had spent her whole life searching for. She was enough. She had always been enough. She had just needed someone brave enough to see it, and in the end, against all odds, she had found him.